What happened in the Supreme Court chamber yesterday left Chief Justice John Roberts red-faced and trembling with rage, while Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's ice-cold response broke the internet and made history in 30 seconds. A routine congressional hearing turned into most explosive political confrontation of 2025. And what Jasmine said next will shock you to your core. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button if you're ready to see how a young black congresswoman just changed American politics forever, and don't forget to subscribe, because what's coming next will blow your mind. The Supreme Court chamber, usually a place of quiet dignity and whisper legal arguments, exploded into chaos when Chief Justice Roberts did something no sitting Chief Justice has ever done in American history. He screamed, not just raise his voice. He screamed at a sitting member of Congress on live television, his face turning purple with rage as cameras captured every second. But Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old freshman congresswoman from Texas, didn't flinch. Instead, what she did next sent shockwaves through Washington and made her an instant global icon. Her response was so cold, so calculated, and so devastating that, within minutes, Jasmine clapback was trending worldwide, and Roberts was scrambling to save his reputation. This wasn't just a political moment. This was the day the old guard American politics met their match in a young black woman who refused to be intimidated. And what you're about to see will show you exactly why the establishment is terrified of leaders like Jasmine Crockett. To understand why this confrontation shook America to its core, you need to know who these two figures really are and why this moment was inevitable. Chief Justice John Roberts, 70 years old, has sat at top America's highest court for nearly 2 decades, appointed by George W. Bush. In 2005, Roberts has carefully crafted an image as the institutionalist, the steady hand protecting the court's reputation, while making decisions that shape American law for generations. With his perfectly combed silver hair and measured tone, Roberts represents everything traditional about American power. White male, Ivy League educated, and absolutely convinced of his own authority. But behind that composed exterior lies something darker. Roberts has presided over some of the most controversial decisions in modern Supreme Court history. He's the man who gutted voting rights protections, who allowed unlimited corporate money in politics, and who's watched silently as a court became the most partisan and least trusted in living memory. Critics say he's more politician than judge, more concerned with power than justice. On the other side, says Jasmine Crockett, and she represents everything the old guard fears most at 43. She's young by Washington standards as a black woman from Dallas. She brings lived experience that most of her colleagues can't even imagine. Before Congress, she was a criminal defense attorney who fought for ordinary people against a system designed to crush them. She's smart, fearless, and absolutely refuses to play by the unwritten rules that keep people like her quiet and grateful. Crockett burst on the national scene during her first term in Congress with a communication style that's part legal precision, part social media savvy, and part righteous anger that resonates with millions of Americans who feel forgotten by their government. She doesn't speak in politician code. She tells the truth, even when it makes powerful people uncomfortable. And that's exactly what brought these two into collision. The Supreme Court had just issued a ruling that effectively ended federal protection for reproductive rights in cases involving minors. Roberts, writing for the majority, had used language that critics callous and out of touch. The decision would force pregnant teenagers to carry unwanted pregnancies, a term even in cases of rape or incest. Unless individual states chose to provide exceptions, Congress was holding emergency hearings on the ruling, and Crockett had been invited to testify. But what nobody expected was for Roberts himself to show up claiming he needed to defend the institutional integrity of the court against congressional criticism. The moment Roberts walked into that hearing room, everyone knew something explosive was about to happen. The Chief Justice rarely appears before Congress, and never to defend controversial rulings. His presence sent a clear message. The court was done being criticized, and he was there to put Congress in its place. Crockett sitting at the witness table in a sharp burgundy blazer, her natural hair styled in a professional. Crown watched Roberts enter with a calm expression of a defense attorney who knows she's about to destroy the prosecution's case. She had come prepared for a fight, but she had no idea Roberts was about to hand her the biggest political victory of her career. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about one Supreme Court ruling. This was about whether America's highest court could continue operating with zero accountability to the people. It was about whether a black woman in Congress would be allowed to speak truth to power, or whether the old boys network would put her back in her place. Roberts thought his reputation and authority would intimidate this freshman congresswoman he was about to learn that Jasmine Crockett doesn't intimidate easily. The tension in the hearing room was electric from a moment Roberts took his seat at the witness table committee. Chairman Jim Jordan had insisted that Roberts be given appropriate deference as chief. But Crockett had made it clear she would ask the same tough questions she'd ask any other witness. The first few exchanges were relatively civil with Robert, giving his standard talking points about judicial independence and constitutional interpretation. But you could see the frustration building on both sides. Roberts clearly expected softball questions and respectful deference. Crockett was treating him like any other witness whose decisions affected people's lives. The first crack in Roberts' composure came when Crockett asked him about the court's declining approval rating. Chief Justice Roberts, she said, her voice steady and professional. Recent polling shows the Supreme Court has the lowest approval rating in modern history. Do you think that might be connected to decisions that seem more political than legal? Roberts' jaw tightened slightly. Congresswoman, the court doesn't make decisions based on polling. We interpret the Constitution as written, not as politicians might prefer. I understand that's your position, Crockett replied smoothly. But when your constitutional interpretation just happened to align perfectly with the Republican Party platform on reproductive rights, voting rights, and corporate power, can you understand why people might question that the room shifted uncomfortably? This wasn't the respectful deference Roberts expected. Committee Republicans tried to interrupt, but Crockett stayed within her time and parliamentary rules. She was following procedure perfectly while systematically dismantling Roberts' talking point. Roberts' voice grew sharper. Congresswoman, I would caution you against imputing the integrity of the court or its justices. We are bound by law and precedent, not political pressure. That's when Crockett smiled, not a friendly smile, but the cold smile of a prosecutor who knows she's about to land a devastating blow. Chief Justice, let's talk about precedent. Your recent ruling overturning reproductive protection for minors, how exactly does it align with the precedent of caring about children's welfare? The question hit like a bomb. Roberts' face flushed red, and for the first time his carefully controlled demeanor cracked. That's a gross mischaracterization of our ruling. He snapped, his voice rising. The court simply returned this issue to the states where it belonged. Constitutionally return it to the states. Crockett repeated, her voice dripping with controlled skepticism. So when a 14-year-old rape victim in Texas can't get medical care because your ruling gave states permission to deny it, that's constitutional when children are forced to carry their rapist baby because of your decision. That's justice. The room erupted. Republicans shouted about procedure, and decorum Democrats leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. But all eyes were on Roberts, whose face was now bright red, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles had turned white. Congresswoman Crockett, Roberts said, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage, you are clearly out of your depth discussing constitutional law. Perhaps you should leave complex legal matters to those who actually understand them. The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The condescension was breathtaking, a white male authority figure essentially telling a successful black female attorney that she wasn't smart enough to understand the law. Every person in that room understood the ugly history behind that kind of dismissal, but Crockett didn't react with anger. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, that cold smile spreading across her face again. Chief Justice, I'm curious about your definition of understanding the law. I spent years as a criminal defense attorney actually practicing law in courtrooms, fighting for real people facing real consequence. How many courtroom trials have you personally handled? Roberts' face went from red to purple. He knew where this was going, and he couldn't stop it as Chief Justice. His experience was primarily academic and administrative. Crockett had actual trial experience, actual clients, actual victories in actual courtrooms. The Chief Justice's role is different from Roberts began. But Crockett cut him off smoothly. Different, yes, more experienced. That's debatable. But let's get back to the children. Your ruling will affect Chief Justice. Do you have daughters? I fail to see how my family is relevant. You have 2 daughters, both adopted, which shows wonderful compassion on your part. Now imagine one of them at 14 years old became pregnant after being raped under your ruling. Depending on which state she lived in, she might be forced to carry that pregnancy to term. How would you feel about that? The room fell silent. Robert's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The question was devastating because it was personal, specific, and utterly unanswerable without either admitting the ruling was cruel or sounding like a hypocrite. The court's decisions are based on constitutional interpretation, not personal feeling. Roberts finally managed his voice, now noticeably shaky. Personal feeling, Crockett repeated softly. So when it's your daughters, it would be about personal feelings, but when it's other people's daughters, especially poor daughters, black daughters, brown daughters, then it's just constitutional interpretation. That's when Roberts lost it completely. The careful mask of judicial temperament that he'd worn for 2 decades finally cracked, and what came out was ugly, raw, and utterly damning. What happened next will be studied in political science classes for decades. Chief Justice John Roberts, the man who prided himself on institutional decorum and judicial temperament, completely lost control on live television. How dare you, Roberts exploded, shooting up from his chair so violently it nearly toppled over his face, was now a mottled purple-red veins bulging in his neck as he pointed a trembling finger directly at Crockett. How dare you bring my family into this? You are a disgrace to this institution. You are a disgrace to Congress. The room erupted in chaos. Committee members were shouting, cameras were flashing, security moved closer to the witness table. But through it all, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands folded calmly in her lap, watching the Chief Justice of the United States have a complete meltdown. You think you can come in here with your grandstanding and your social media sound bites and attack the highest court in the land? Roberts continued screaming, spittle flying from his mouth. You don't have the experience. You don't have the intellect. You don't have the right. Every word was being broadcast live on C-SPAN, CNN, Fox News, and streaming platforms around the world. Millions of people were watching the Chief Justice of the United States lose his mind at a black congresswoman who had simply asked him tough questions about his own decisions. But Roberts wasn't done in his rage. He said the words that would end his career. Maybe if you spent more time studying law and less time playing to the cameras, you'd understand how government actually works. But I suppose that's too much to expect from someone like you. Someone like you. The phrase hung in the air like a nuclear explosion. Everyone in the room knew exactly what he meant. Someone like you. Young, black, female apidity. Not knowing her place. It was every racist, sexist dog whistle rolled into one respectful phrase. The hearing room fell completely silent. Even Republicans looked shocked at what their Chief Justice had just said. On live television, Chairman Jordan was frantically signaling for a recess, but it was too late. The damage was done, and through it all, Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. She sat there perfectly composed, watching Roberts' career implode in real time. When the screaming finally stopped, and Roberts stood there, breathing heavily, his expensive suit rumpled and his hair disheveled, Crockett slowly leaned forward to her microphone. Her voice, when it came, was soft, controlled, and absolutely devastating. Chief Justice Roberts, she said, her tone as calm as if she were discussing the weather. I want to thank you for that response because you just proved every point I was trying to make. Roberts, still standing, opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett continued, in that same unnaturally calm voice. You see, for 20 minutes, asked you substantive questions about your legal decisions and their real-world consequence. Questions any appellate attorney might ask questions. Any constitutional law professor might ask questions. Any concerned citizen should be allowed to ask. She paused, letting that sink in, and your response was to scream at me, question my intelligence, and suggest that someone like me doesn't belong here. Chief Justice, you just demonstrated exactly why Americans have lost faith in the Supreme Court. Roberts tried to interrupt, but Crockett's voice cut through his attempt like a knife. You couldn't defend your decisions on their merits, so you attacked me personally. You couldn't justify the consequences of your rulings, so you questioned my qualifications. And when pressed about real children who will suffer real harm from your choices, you had a tantrum that would embarrass a toddler. The cameras captured every word, every gesture, every devastating pause. Social media was already exploding with clips of Roberts' meltdown and Crockett's response. Chief Justice, you asked about my qualification. Let me remind you, I graduated summa cum laude from law school. I've won cases in state and federal court. I've represented hundreds of clients, including children, in exactly the situations your ruling will create. I've been elected by the people to represent them in Congress. Another pause. This one even more devastating than the last. Your qualifications for your position. You were appointed by a president who lost a popular vote and confirmed by senators representing a minority of Americans. You've never tried a case. You've never represented a scared teenager. You've never had to explain to a rape victim why the law won't protect her. Roberts was visibly shaking now. Whether from rage or humiliation, it was impossible to tell. So when you ask if I understand how government works, here's my answer. Yes, I do. I understand that in a democracy, even Supreme Court justices are supposed to be accountable. To the people they serve, I understand that no one, not even you, is above questioning when your decisions affect real lives. She leaned even close to the microphone. Her voice dropped into barely above a whisper, but every word audible in the silent room. And I understand that when someone in power can't handle being questioned by a black woman that tells us everything we need to know about both their character and their qualifications, the final blow was delivered with surgical precision. Chief Justice Roberts, thank you for showing America exactly who you really are. I yield back my time, and with that, Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and waited. Robert stood there for another few seconds, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water before finally collapsing back into his chair. His face had gone from purple to gray, and his hands were visibly trembling. Committee Chairman Jordan called for an immediate recess, but it didn't matter. The damage was complete in less than 5 minutes. Jasmine Crockett had systematically destroyed the reputation of the Chief Justice of the United States, using nothing but his own words and behavior. The aftermath was immediate and devastating for Roberts. Roberts' rage and fraud. Jasmine clapback were trending worldwide within minutes. The clip of him screaming, "Someone like you," was being shared millions of times per hour. Legal scholars were calling for his resignation. Even conservative commentators were struggling to defend his behavior. But for Jasmine Crockett, this was just another day standing up for what's right. As she gathered her papers and prepared to leave the hearing room, she looked like exactly what she was: a woman who had just changed American politics forever, and who wasn't even slightly surprised that she'd won. The explosion that followed the Roberts-Crockett confrontation wasn't just political. It was seismic, reshaping American discourse about power, accountability, and who gets to question authority in the United States. Within 30 minutes of the hearing ending, social media had erupted into the biggest political firestorm of 2025. Roberts' rage accumulated over 2.3 million tweets in the first hour alone. The video of Roberts screaming, "Someone like you," was shared 847,000 times on Twitter, 1.2 million times on TikTok, and became the most watched C-SPAN clip in the network's history. But it wasn't just the quantity of responses. It was the quality and diversity. Political figures from across the spectrum were weighing in, and reactions revealed deep fractures in how Americans view authority and accountability. Progressive leaders rallied behind Crockett immediately. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted within minutes, "This is what happens when you question power with facts instead of deference," at Jasmine Crockett, to showed America what real leadership looks like. The tweet received 340,000 likes in 2 hours. Senator Bernie Sanders was more direct. Chief Justice Roberts' disgraceful outburst shows exactly why we need Supreme Court reform. No one is above accountability, especially when children's lives are at stake, but perhaps the most powerful support came from an unexpected source, retired Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who at 95 years old rarely makes public statements. Her brief comment released through her foundation was devastating. In 50 years of public service, I have never seen such an inappropriate display of temperament from any judicial officer. The court's dignity demands better. Republican reactions were more complicated and revealed significant cracks in conservative unity. Traditional conservatives were horrified by Roberts' behavior, even if they disagree with Crockett's politics. Senator Susan Collins called the outburst deeply concerning and suggested Roberts should issue a public apology. But the Trump wing of the party saw an opportunity. They had always viewed Roberts as insufficiently conservative, and his meltdown gave them permission to attack him openly. Tucker Carlson spent an entire segment arguing that Roberts finally showed his true colors, an entitled establishment figure who can't handle being questioned by someone who actually represents a people. The legal community's response was swift and brutal. The American Bar Association issued an unprecedented statement expressing grave concern about the Chief Justice's departure from judicial temperament. Harvard Law School, Roberts' alma mater, announced they will be reviewing his honorary positions. More damaging with responses from individual legal scholars. Professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "In 40 years of constitutional law, I've never seen anything like this." Roberts has irreparably damaged the court's credibility. Conservative legal scholar Stephen Calibri wrote in the Wall Street Journal, "The Chief Justice's behavior was inexcusable and has set back the cause of judicial authority by decades." International reaction was equally damning. The BBC ran the confrontation as their lead story with the headline, "U.S. Chief Justice's Racist Outburst Shocks World." Lemon called it, "The day American justice lost its dignity." Even allies were struggling to defend American institutions, but the most telling responses came from ordinary Americans, and they revealed a country hungry for leaders who would actually fight for them. Maria Gonzalez, a teacher from Phoenix, posted a TikTok that went viral. "I watched that whole thing with my teenage daughter when that old man started screaming at Congresswoman Crockett. My daughter said, 'Mom, she's not backing down. That's the kind of leader we need, someone who fights for us instead of fighting for system." David Williams, a veteran from Ohio, wrote on Facebook, "I'm a Republican, but Roberts was wrong. You don't scream at a woman doing her job just because you don't like her question." Crockett handled that like a professional. He acted like a child. The economic impact was immediate and surprising. Crockett's campaign received over $2.3 million in donations in 48 hours, mostly in small amounts, from people who had never donated to political campaigns before her speech. Defending her response was viewed 23 million times across all platforms. Meanwhile, Chief Justice Roberts faced calls for resignation from multiple quarters. A petition on change, or demanding his resignation, collected 890,000 signatures in 3 days. More seriously, several Democratic senators announced they will be introducing legislation to reform the Supreme Court, with Roberts' behavior as Exhibit A for why change was needed. The legal implications were profound. Several pending cases before the Supreme Court suddenly faced new scrutiny about whether Roberts could fairly adjudicate them, given his obvious political bias. Civil rights organizations announced they would be filing motions for his recusal in any case involving racial or gender discrimination. Perhaps most damaging for Roberts, his outburst gave legitimacy to long-standing criticisms of the court's political nature. For years, legal scholars had argued that the Supreme Court operated more like a partisan political body than a neutral judicial institution. Roberts had always insisted otherwise, positioning himself as an institutionalist, protecting the court's dignity. But his screaming fit at a black congresswoman made those arguments impossible. To maintain Professor Melissa Murray of NYU Law School put it perfectly. Roberts spent 20 years building a reputation as the institutional Chief Justice. He destroyed it in 5 minutes of pure, unveiled bias. The political ramifications extended far beyond one confrontation. Democratic strategists immediately began using the incident to argue for Supreme Court expansion and reform. This is what happens when you give lifetime appointments to politicians and rogues. Became a rallying cry for progressive activists. More importantly, the confrontation changed. How Americans viewed both figures involved Roberts, who had carefully crafted an image as a thoughtful-tempered jurist, was now seen as just another angry white man who couldn't handle being questioned by a black woman. His authority was permanently damaged. Crockett, meanwhile, had become a national political star. Overnight speaking requests poured in from universities, civil rights organizations, and political groups. Publishing companies offered book deals. Netflix reached out about documentary projects. But Crockett's response to her newfound fame was typically focused on substance over celebrity. In a press conference 2 days after the confrontation, she addressed the attention directly. "I didn't go into that hearing room to become famous. I went there to ask necessary questions about decisions that affect real people's lives. If my willingness to do that job makes some people uncomfortable, that says more about them than it does about me," she continued. Chief Justice Roberts called me someone like me as if that were an insult. He's right. I am someone. Like me, I'm someone who came from a working family, someone who put herself through law school, someone who represented clients who couldn't afford fancy lawyers, someone who was elected by people who wanted their voices heard in Washington. If that threatens powerful people, good. It should. The confrontation also sparked broader conversations about race, gender, and power in American institutions. Young women of color across the country saw Crockett's performance as proof that they belonged in spaces of power, regardless of who tried to intimidate them. Someone like me became a rallying cry, with thousands of women sharing their own stories of being dismissed or diminished in professional settings. The hashtag became a movement, with women running for office, applying for promotions, and speaking up in meetings with new confidence. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on the Supreme Court itself. Roberts' outbursts had revealed the ugly truth that many Americans suspected but couldn't prove, that the court's decisions were driven more by political bias than legal reasoning. Public trust in the court, already at historic lows, collapsed completely. Polling showed that only 23% of Americans believed the Supreme Court was impartial, down from 37% before the confrontation. More damaging, 67% of Americans now supported major reforms to court, including term limits for justice. The incident also energized judicial reform movements at the state level. Several states announced they would be reviewing their own judicial selection processes, with many citing Roberts' behavior as evidence that lifetime appointments created accountability problems. The corporate world also took notice. Major law firms quietly began distancing themselves from Roberts, with several prestigious firms removing him from their advisory boards. Corporate clients started questioning whether cases argued before Roberts could be considered fairly decided, given his obvious capacity for personal bias. Entertainment industry figures jumped into the conversation as well. Oprah Winfrey tweeted, "Watching a Jasmine Crockett handle that situation with such grace and power reminded me why representation matters when we see ourselves in positions of authority. Everything changes." The tweet was retweeted over 400,000 times. Late-night television had a field day with the confrontation. Stephen Colbert's monologue about Chief Justice Karen went viral, while Trevor Noah's impression of Roberts' tantrum became an instant classic. Saturday Night Live dedicated an entire cold open to the incident, with their Roberts character throwing an increasingly ridiculous tantrum, while their Crockett character remained perfectly composed throughout. The international legal community weighed in as well. The International Court of Justice issued a rare statement expressing concern about judicial temperament standards in democratic society. Legal organizations from Canada to Germany cited the incident as an example of why judicial accountability mechanisms were essential. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Roberts issued a carefully worded public statement expressing regret for for his unfortunate choice of words and reaffirming his commitment to judicial temperament. But the damage was done. Legal observers noted that Roberts avoided actually apologizing and continued to defend the substance of his position. Behind-the-scenes sources revealed that several Supreme Court justices had privately expressed dismay at Roberts' behavior. Elena Kagan reportedly told colleagues that Roberts had set back judicial credibility by decades. Even conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch was said to be deeply troubled by the Chief Justice's loss of composure. The Federal Judicial Center responsible for training federal judges announced they would be implementing new mandatory training on appropriate responses to congressional oversight, a clear response to Roberts' meltdown legal ethics. Professors began using the confrontation as a prime example of how not to handle criticism in their courses. Crockett's response to Roberts' statement was characteristically direct: actions matter more than words. If the Chief Justice truly regrets his behavior, he should recuse himself from cases involving the rights of people he's demonstrated bias against. Otherwise, this is just damage control. The story continued to evolve with new developments emerging. Weekly ethics complaints were filed against Roberts with the Judicial Conduct Board. Law schools began incorporating the confrontation into their curricula as an example of how not to handle judicial criticism. Most importantly, the confrontation had changed the rules of engagement. Between Congress and the Supreme Court, never again would just be able to expect automatic deference. Simply because of their positions, Crockett had proven that thoughtful, persistent questioning could expose a political nature of supposedly neutral judicial decisions. The incident became a case study in how power dynamics can shift in an instant when someone refuses to accept their assigned role. Roberts expected Crockett to be deferential and grateful for the opportunity to question him. Instead, she treated him like what he was, a public servant whose decisions affected millions of lives. In doing so, she didn't just win a political confrontation. She changed how Americans think about accountability, authority, and who gets to ask the tough questions in a democracy. 6 months later, as calls for Roberts' resignation continued, and Crockett's influence in Congress grew, the lesson was clear in American democracy. No one is too powerful to be questioned, and no one is too young, too black, or too female to do the questioning. The video of their confrontation remained one of the most watched political clips of all time, shared millions of times with captions like, "This is what courage looks like," and "Never let them intimidate you." The confrontation also sparked unexpected conversations in unlikely places. Corporate boardrooms began discussing Crockett moments, instances where junior employees effectively challenged senior leadership with facts and preparation. Business schools started incorporating the exchange into leadership courses, analyzing how Crockett's calm professionalism under attack demonstrated superior executive presence compared to Roberts' emotional volatility. Religious communities were divided but largely supportive of Crockett's approach. The National Baptist Convention praised her Christ-like composure under persecution, while progressive Catholic groups noted how her defense of vulnerable children aligned with core Christian values. Even some conservative evangelical leaders privately admitted that Roberts' behavior was ungodly and unbecoming of a Christian leader. Youth engagement in politics surged dramatically after the confrontation. Voter registration among 18 to 25-year-olds increased by 340% in the month following the incident, with many citing Crockett's example as inspiration to get involved in democracy. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was just Tuesday. She had more questions to ask, more fights to fight, and more powerful people to hold accountable, because that's what someone like her does. She shows up, speaks truth, and refuses to back down. And America was watching, learning, and demanding more leaders exactly like her. If this story of courage and accountability inspired you, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible political moments that are reshaping America. Because when leaders like Jasmine Crockett stand up to power, we all win. Hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next in the fight for real democracy.